a stiffer wooden rail that when it's bent and springs back, it's springing back from like being in the water. So you definitely feel a lot more kick out of your turns. What's that? 4 points we've covered. Okay, there's a bit there.
What about the relation of thickness? Because I noticed, I first thought it was Australian style thinner boards, but they're wider, aren't they?
That leads exactly to the next one.
Sorry, could you make that point again?
It is, they appear to be quite thin. Maybe it's because I'm European and we've got this more sloppy way than you have.
Oh, the boards appear thin.
They are thin. Do they have to be thin? To your concept.
Well,
your concept.
If they're thinner, you can take advantage of flex more. So if the board is thicker, naturally it's not going to flex as well as if it's thinner. So to take advantage of the whole flex and flex return concept, definitely having not so much volume helps. But at the moment, volume, I really feel like in the last 2 or 3 years, volume has become like a talking point. You know, I see on boards now they have volume written down. You see on websites they put the volume in. And I think there's a myth at the moment that volume is going to help you catch waves. It's basically just not the case. The most critical aspect of wave catching is the surface area and making sure you've got enough surface area to match your body weight. And what it comes down to is you've got speed, area, and the weight of the rider. So the more area that you have, because a surfboard only works when it's up and planing on top of the water. It'll be a little bit like having a guy who can water ski behind a boat. You could be a really good water skier, but if the boat's not going fast enough to pull the water skier up out of the water and have him planing along on top, it doesn't matter how good you are, it just won't function as a water ski. So a surfboard only functions when it's up and planing on top of the water. So the more area that you have, the less speed you need to get up and planing. The less area you have, the more speed. So you can plane on your bare feet if you're going fast enough. So basically, you could have a certain size rider be able to get up and planing on a board because he's got adequate area, but then you can put someone who's 10 kilo heavier on the same board and they won't be able to get up and planing because they're putting more weight on that same surface area. So they need proportionately more surface area for their body weight. It's a pretty, there's a ratio of like square inches of surface area to kilo of body weight formula. That's actually quite effective, and it's something that I've used for about 15 years now. After having some issues with my boards, maybe in my mid-20s, it's probably 20 years now, I had a young guy who was riding for me. He worked at the factory and we'd go surfing together, and whenever the waves were like this big, he's like just flying along and he's busting airs and just getting max speed, and I'm literally getting nowhere. I'm just jumping to my feet, sinking in the bottom turn, digging a rail. But if the waves were this big or more, I could surf no problem, but in small surf I was just getting nowhere. And so then I had this idea. I thought, right, I'm going to do a calculation. I'm going to figure out the surface area of his board, and then I'm going to divide his body weight into the area to give me a sort of an area versus kilo of body weight ratio. Then for my weight, I'm going to use that same formula to see how much area I would need. And it totally blew me out. Like, for me to have the equivalent board to him, I needed something like 23 inches wide. And so I ended up building myself a 23-inch wide board, and all of a sudden I'm in waves this big, and now I'm just surfing along, heaps of speed, cutbacks, 3-0s, slides, anything I wanted to do, I could now do in small surf because I had the right area to match my body weight. And the board I had, incidentally, was only 1 7/8 thick, but 23 inches wide, so I had no volume in it. When I sat on it, I sat up to here in the water, but as soon as I took a few strokes, I was just up and planing on the surface of the water.
23 is really wide, isn't it?
23 inch wide.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really wide.
Yeah, so I ended up
When
going.
surfing, it was no problem. It was really,
It was fine in small surf,
yeah.
but then in bigger surf I didn't have an issue because the waves were faster, but I had the main issue in small surf. So that's the other thing. It's also related to the waves you're riding at the time. You know, when you're surfing really big waves, you can ride a really narrow tail board, and you can ride something quite narrow. You don't need much area because you're going a lot faster. So the surface area will be relevant to the speed that you're going to be going, whether you're going fast or slow, small waves, big waves. And yeah, so you've got the area, the speed and the weight, they've got to be tied in together, but you don't need volume. You only need enough volume to float you. And as a general rule, it's about 1 litre of volume in a surfboard will float 3 kilos of body weight. Anything less than that and you'll struggle a bit, but that's a guideline. But a lot of people think that if they get a big fat board, they're going to catch waves easy, but it's a myth because the area is the key factor. But then you see a lot of designs now where you'll have a board that's quite wide and thick. You could knock an inch of thickness out and they'll still work just as good. Yeah. And yeah, so here we touched on volume there as well. With the volume of a board, it only needs to be enough to float you. You don't need more. It's, you know, what volume does is it gives you static float. So while you're sitting there waiting for a wave, it'll hold you at a certain position in the water. Like if you have inadequate surface area and inadequate volume, you're going to get nowhere. But you could have inadequate volume and still have plenty of surface area. So the board that I was talking about before that I had, which was 1 7/8 and 23 inches wide, it had adequate area for my body weight, but it had completely inadequate volume. So when I sat there, I was right up here. It used to take me 2 or 3 strokes to feel like I was climbing up out of the water. So with having adequate volume, you just want enough volume so that you're in a comfortable position. So when you lay down and start paddling, you're sort of buried on top of the water. You don't have to climb your way out. Now, obviously, more volume is going to give you an easier start as far as being sort of on top of the water, but it's just the first stroke or two. The downside is that if you've got big fat rails and a lot of board, when it comes to the general performance of the board, you're going to be fighting a fat rail, you're going to have issues with hold, trying to bury a thick rail, so a fat board will really hinder a board's performance as well.
But it's good to see because there's all these points that all make the board different or not different. So if you're not fast enough, you're trying to fight it with volume, but you only should go a little bit of volume because you still don't want to lose the flex. Because if you lose the flex, you lose the performance again. So that's the whole.
And if a board's stiff and it doesn't bend, then you can't take advantage of the spring back.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's almost the most important part of it because it makes the board being able to catch more waves or more turns.
The example was great for us Germans as traveling surfers because this happens to us all the time. Because when we go to the ocean, we so badly want to surf. We want to surf on anything. Anyway, if it's like this, we're going out.
Yes.
We need the right material for that.
Or you mean the right board?
The right board, yeah.
Yeah, well I think too, you've got to sometimes be realistic about what the right board is. Like where I surf a lot now is in the Gulf of Thailand, and I mean the waves are really average. It's probably like the East Sea.
They're probably worse.
Okay. So I only get to surf my shortboard a handful of times, but a lot of the times a longboard is just a more appropriate board for those conditions. But I do notice that I see a lot of people kind of struggling on a shortboard to try and make it work, but then sometimes it's just not the right board for the right day. So it's just your choice of board or what you use can make the difference between having a fun surf or not having a fun surf.
But what that means in the end, it's kind of like you could either go there and make it work, but then you lose some performance, or you could go there and make it work, and you still have more of this.
Yeah.
And that's exactly. But then again, this will not work. This will work with some materials and with some other materials better.
Yeah.
That's kind of where all these things work together somehow.
So I'll try and be I'll try and like tidy this up because
The worst one is this.
I'm leaving it till last, okay? Maybe we have a beer break before then. Yeah, so coming back to your rail too, what do we got? Yeah, okay, soft edge, hard edge, bottom edge. The rail on a board is really critical, I suppose, the rail volume. Like we discussed a bit already, like if you've got a thick rail, the first thing you need to do when you turn your board is you need to drop one rail in. That's the very first thing you think about when you do a turn. And so as you drop a rail in, if you've got a fat rail, it's literally going to be harder to sink it. You've just got more volume there that you've got to fight in. And as well as that, you're going to have some surface area literally on the side that you've got to try and fight into the water as well. So generally, if a rail's too thick, the board's going to feel corky, like it's stuck on top of the water, and it's kind of going to feel slow to respond. If you have a nice thin rail, then it's going to respond quicker. Now, with the soft and hard edge, what will happen is if you have a hard edge, as water's flowing down the board, it'll hit that hard edge and just release clean off. So when you run a bit more of an edge all the way around on a board, it creates more release. Like a really good thing to do one time would be to just get a hose, get your garden hose, and just run it over your board. And just watch the way it releases from the tail and the way it wraps the round rail up the front. And it actually taught me a lot, just running a hose over a board and running it over the contours and around the fins. So a hard edge will release water, and a round rail will cause water to wrap the rail and pull around onto the deck. So quite often you see a lot of longboards, they have a very soft rail all the way through. And so what happens is it makes the water wrap up onto the deck, and then as the water's on the deck of the board, you can walk up and hang 5 or hang 10 because the wave is literally wrapping the deck and holding it down. If you have too soft of an edge on a small wave board, it'll do the same thing. It will literally suck it down. There's times where you want a soft rail, like if you're going into bigger surf, if your edge is too hard and it has too much release, as you drop into a large wave, it can literally slide out in the bottom turn, get slippery, whereas a soft edge will hug the face a bit more as the water wraps onto the deck and wraps around it. So, yeah, so a soft bottom edge, water will wrap, hard bottom edge, water releases. Thicker rail, harder to bury, thinner rail, easier to bury. So, but it also comes down to the ability of the rider.